Welcome back to Healthy Living for Life. Joining us now is Detective Patrick McDuffie of the Lewis and Clark County Sheriff's Office. And thank you so much for being here, Detective.
Absolutely.
So can we start out by just asking, are all emergency or first responders now taking Narcan or naloxone with them when they're out on the streets?
I can't speak for every agency, but it's now available for every agency, for any first responder. It doesn't have to be a first responder. There's a training course that was coordinated through the state. And once you complete the training, agencies would send employees or associated personnel to the training and then to become trainers, and then they can bring that back to their agency and train the folks within their agency, and then they can administer Narcan. So the training I went to was in Missoula, and it was, there was school officials, there was a lot of different people from throughout the community involved with the training. So it's not just first responders, it's available for different people throughout the community.
Oh, okay. And so when did all of that start, where they started giving it out to people in the community?
In 2017, a bill was passed through legislation that allowed for Narcan or naloxone to be a lot more available. Before it was only available to at least advanced EMTs or paramedics on an ambulance crew. And then with the new legislation, it allowed for it to be available to a lot of different people throughout the community.
Okay. And you mentioned that you went and got training about it. What did that training entail, or what did you learn about?
The biggest thing that I got out of the training is there's no negative effects to administering Narcan. If there's any indication that someone may be in an overdose, to administer Narcan. If we have an elderly individual or somebody who may be at risk of a heart attack and there's no signs of an opioid overdose, then we probably wouldn't administer it. But if there's any indication that there's a possibility of an overdose, it saves people's lives, and there's no negative effects to administering it. If someone's not in an overdose, there's no harm to that person.
Okay. And then you mentioned indications of an opioid overdose. What does that look like? How do you know when you arrive on a scene that someone could be overdosing on an opioid and need Narcan or naloxone?
There would be a lot of different indicators. One of speaking to witnesses, and then a second of just observing the scene and looking for any paraphernalia, any prescription bottles. And like I say, if we had somebody who who wasn't elderly, or who may not have been a higher risk patient or person for a cardiac event, then we'd probably administer Narcan.
Okay. And then once you administer it, then what happens? What are the next steps?
Depending on the reaction of the patient, it more than likely will be continuing CPR. If we find somebody who's in an overdose, we're probably, we're going to check their airway, breathing, and circulation. And if they're not breathing, they don't have a pulse, we're going to be doing CPR, and we're going to administer Narcan. And then if they don't respond immediately, we're going to continue CPR. If they do respond and become responsive, or at least get a pulse, then we'll put them into a recovery position and monitor the patient.
Okay. And so, being a detective with the Sheriff's Office, do you get a feel for, we've talked about that we're in an opioid epidemic. Do you agree with that? Do you get a feel for how serious people are using prescription opioids? What kind of problem is that really?
I think probably the biggest problem we have in our community, and I think it's become nationwide, is more of a heroin epidemic than prescription drugs. I think the industry has done a pretty good job of 10 years ago, we had a huge problem with prescription drugs being abused, but the industry is really taking a lot of steps to reduce the availability and the abuse of prescription drugs. And in that, now the users are going to heroin. And the prevalency of heroin in our community has absolutely exploded. For the last 5 years, I've been working on the Missouri River Drug Task Force as a narcotics detective. And 5 years ago, we per se didn't have any heroin in our community, and now it's as prevalent as methamphetamine or several other illegal drugs. It's everywhere, and it's being abused.
So you would agree that we're in an opioid crisis?
Yes, without a doubt.
Okay, and so with Montana and the other states that this show is broadcasted to and that we share the show with, we're rural. Do you see a difference in people living in rural areas using opioid drugs versus maybe people living in more urban areas?
I think some of the more urban areas had it, especially to the west. It was there faster. It was there sooner than what we experienced. That we didn't have. Talking to other detectives in the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon were having a huge issue with it before we were. Even Kalispell was seeing a lot more of it 5 years ago than what we were, but now it's everywhere. So it doesn't matter the size of the community. I do some work up in Lincoln, and we've had issues with it up in Lincoln. It's everywhere.
And you talked too that after it's administered, either you would continue doing CPR or the person is responsive. Do you think that one happens more than the other? Is naloxone saving lives? What's your experience from what you've seen?
I was on a call as a patrol deputy probably 8 years ago, and we responded to a non-responsive patient and started providing CPR to the patient. And once St. Pete's ambulance arrived, they administered naloxone. And I went up to the hospital a short time later, and the individual was alive. He was walking and talking, and didn't appear to have any effects from his overdose. And when we were initially on scene, nobody was telling us that he'd used any opioids, so we didn't know it was an overdose initially. So it, without a doubt, saved that guy's life. But I've had a lot of users telling me stories about where they've seen it administered by other users, other heroin addicts, just because heroin's so dangerous, and then with fentanyl and fentanyl and all the synthetics that we're seeing out there, users are carrying Narcan, and it's saving their lives.
Okay.
Not even being administered by first responders, being administered by other addicts.
Okay, perfect. We're actually out of time, Detective, so thanks so much for your expertise and for being here this morning.
You're welcome.
We need to take another break, but coming up next, as we've learned, naloxone is saving lives and preventing opioid deaths, but it's only a temporary fix. There's more that must be done to help us out of this opioid crisis. We'll talk about that and more right after these messages. Stay tuned.